The brand hit the door in one long hiss of smoke, close enough that Wren felt the heat on her cheek. Not her skin. That was the mercy, they said. A name burned into wood instead of flesh. Wren called her blood traitor. Cast. She stood in the yard with her healer's satchel and nothing else, snow soaking through her boots, and watched her father not look at her. "You refuse the beta," said the pack elder, as if she needed reminding of her own crime. "You refuse the bond he offered, in front of the whole hall." "He offered a bond like a man handing over a leash," Wren said. "I said no. That's not treason." "Your blood runs wrong," the elder said. "It always has. We should have known when the wounded stopped screaming around you." That part was true. She'd never understood it, how the worst injuries went quiet under her hands, how frightened wolves settled instead of snapping. She'd called it a gift once. Now it was a charge. Her father's study window went dark before she reached the tree line. She didn't cry. She'd used that up already, back when it might have changed something. Somewhere past the tree line, wolves she'd never met were already howling over a battle she knew nothing about. And in 3 days, their wounds would be hers to close. 3 days walking put her at the edge of Ashgrave land, a kingdom she knew only by rumor. An alpha king who'd broken 4 Reaver raids in 1 season, whose court didn't ask where a healer came from if her hands worked. The patrol that found her wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel either. 6 riders, war-marked, exhausted in the specific way of men who'd just come from something bad. "Healer?" the lead rider asked, eyeing her satchel. "Since I was 12. "We buried 9 men yesterday. We have 40 more who might not need burying if someone competent gets to them first." He looked at her Exile brand, the fresh red rope burn on her wrists where Hollowmere had bound her at the border, like she was dangerous cargo. "You're not from anywhere we know." "No," Wren agreed. "I'm not from anywhere anymore." He considered that a long moment, then jerked his chin toward the camp smoke rising over the ridge. "The king won't care where you're from. He'll care if you're fast." The camp itself announced its own losses before she reached it. Rows of horses without riders, a supply wagon still stacked with unclaimed shrouds, the particular silence that settled over men who'd survived something they hadn't expected to. Whatever had happened at that battle, it had cost Ashgrave more than a victory ought to. The war camp was chaos organized by exhaustion. Cots in rows, the smell of blister root and blood. Healers moving like they hadn't slept since the battle ended. Nobody went near the tent at the camp center. It had iron stakes driven into the earth around it in a wide circle, and warded chain looped between them. And the guards stationed there stood well back from the fabric wall. "What's in there?" Wren asked, setting a splint. The healer beside her, an older woman named Fenna, didn't look up. "The king." "Why is he chained off from his own war tent?" "Because he isn't the king in there. Not yet." Fenna's hands didn't slow. "The red takes him after a bad battle. Wolf runs the body until the blood frenzy burns out on its own. Could be a day, could be 3. Nobody goes near him until it passes." "What happens if someone does?" Fenna's eyes flicked up, and for the first time she stopped working. "They don't come back out to tell you." Even calm, they said he'd broken 4 Reaver war bands without losing a single border fort. The one time a lord tested his patience over grazing rights, that lord's holding belonged to Ashgrave by season's end. No battle required, just the quiet certainty that resistance wasn't worth the cost. Nobody in this camp needed telling twice what it meant to stand on his wrong side. In the red, that certainty simply stopped being quiet. Something low in the tent made a sound then. Not quite a growl. Not quite a voice. The chains sang faintly where the thing inside had leaned its weight against them. Wren's hands, mid-stitch, went still. She wasn't meant to be anywhere near the center circle. She told herself that for exactly as long as it took to walk there, drawn by something she didn't have a name for. The way you're drawn to a sound you can't place until you're standing right on top of it. The guards saw her coming and raised their hands. Stop! Don't! And then stopped themselves, because the tent had gone silent. Not calm. Silent the way a held breath is silent. A shape moved against the canvas from the inside, low and huge, dragging chain. It stopped a foot from the wall nearest her, so close the fabric shivered with each exhale. Get her back, one guard hissed to the other. Get her back now. The chain went taut. Then it didn't retreat. Its nose worked the air near the seam of the tent. Once, twice, sorting her out from wood smoke and old blood, and 40 other bodies packed into that camp, the way a hound singles out 1 scent from 100. It waited. Wren felt it in her sternum before she understood what it meant. That same weight she'd felt her whole life around wounded, frightened things, except 100 times heavier, pressing outward through canvas and iron like it was reaching for her specifically. It's never done that, the second guard said, voice gone thin. Not once. Not for anyone. They dragged her back from the circle by the arm, more frightened for her than of her, and put 3 cots and a healer's tent between her and the king's prison for the rest of the night. It didn't help. She could still feel it. A thread pulled tight between her chest and that tent, humming when the wind shifted. You should leave the camp at first light, Fenna told her, low, checking Wren's pulse like she suspected fever. Whatever that was, it isn't safe. For you or for him. I didn't do anything. I know. That's what worries me. Fenna's grip tightened. The red doesn't recognize faces. It recognizes threats, and it recognizes prey. It's never recognized anything else. Until you stood there, and it went quiet. Wren thought of her father's hall, the way wounded men stopped screaming under her hands. The word burned into the door. Your blood runs wrong. I've been called dangerous before, she said. Nobody ever explained why. Then maybe, Fenna said. It's time somebody did. Outside, faint but constant, the chain sang again. 6 feet of silver dragged an inch closer to the edge of the tent, and held. The camp's oldest healer was a blind man named Ask, who'd served 3 kings and buried 2. He listened to Wren's story without interrupting, then asked her to hold out her wrist. He pressed 2 fingers to her pulse and went very still. Emberkin, he said. That's not a word I know. It wouldn't be. Your bloodline was hunted to nothing 200 years ago. Old packs feared it. A blood that calms frenzy instead of feeding it. A touch that a wolf's instinct reads as safe, even when the wolf itself has lost every other instinct it owns. He tilted his head toward the sound of the distant chain. Your own pack likely sensed it in you and didn't have a word for their fear, so they gave you a different one. Wrong. Traitor. So the beast isn't reacting to me. It's reacting to what's in me. Both, Ask said. The wolf senses the blood. The king, underneath the wolf, is the one who moved toward it. That part isn't lineage. That part is choice, even buried this deep. You said hunted. Why? Because an alpha who can't be calmed can't be controlled, and an alpha who trusts a stranger's hands over his own counsels is dangerous to whoever holds that counsel. Ask's voice had gone flat, old grief worn smooth. 2 centuries back, a king executed every Emberkin healer in his court, rather than let his advisors lose their grip on him. I know the story because my grandmother was one of the 3 who ran far enough. Wren said nothing for a long moment. It explained more than she wanted it to. Wren looked toward the iron circle, where the fabric wall still bowed faintly outward, straining toward her like a plant toward light. What happens if I go in there? Ask's blind eyes didn't waver. Then we find out if 200 years of fear was wrong. Word moved through a war camp faster than any messenger. By the next morning, the king's steward, a narrow, careful man named Ulrich, was waiting at Wren's cot with 2 guards and a voice like a closing door. You'll be escorted out of camp, Ulrich said, quietly, before the king wakes and remembers whatever instinct made a fool of him in front of his own soldiers. He didn't wake yet. I haven't done anything but exist near a tent.
You've done more than that, and you know it. Ulrich's eyes were flat. The king has promised, healer. Lady Vane's father commands the only fleet standing between this coast and the Reaver warships massing since spring. Break that match, and you don't just cost the king a wife. You cost him a coastline. Whatever the frenzy responded to in you, it ends here, quietly or not. Is that a threat? It's an arrangement, Ulrich said. Take the coin. Take the road south. Don't be here when he's himself again. Wren looked past him, toward the iron circle, where the chain had gone taut once more, straining in her direction like it could hear its own fate being decided. I didn't ask to be dangerous to your alliance, she said. But I'm done being told to disappear, because I'm inconvenient to someone else's plans. Ulrich's mouth thinned. Then you'll be removed. They came for her at dusk, not Ulrich's men, but riders in unfamiliar colors. Hollowmere colors, her father's colors, moving through the camp's outer picket like they'd been let in on purpose. She's ours, the lead rider told the sentries. Exile property. We're owed her back. It was a lie built to look like law, and it might have worked, except the ground under the camp had started to shake. Not an earthquake, but something rhythmic, deliberate. Chain dragging against iron stake after stake after stake. The king's tent wall tore. He came through it on 4 legs first, a shape too large for the space he'd been kept in. Fur matted dark with 3 days of dried battle blood. Eyes wolf gold and empty of anything human. Guards scattered. Ulrich shouted an order nobody obeyed. The beast crossed the camp in a straight, unbroken line, and it did not stop at the Hollowmere riders. It put itself between them and Wren, low and silent, and every man in that yard understood the message without a word being spoken. It was close enough now that she could smell the old blood on it, feel the heat coming off its ribs. She didn't step back. Some part of her understood that stepping back would be its own kind of answer. And this, whatever this was, deserved better than fear. The beast lowered its blood-matted head, slow, deliberate, and pressed its skull against her open palm in front of the whole camp. Not a threat display, a claim, made in the one language it had left, offered where every soldier in Ashgrave could see exactly whose it had decided she was. Ulrich found his voice last of all. "Get her behind me. Someone restrain." "No one restrains him," Osk said, appearing at Wren's shoulder, cane tapping steady against frozen ground. "Not now. Look at what he chose the moment he broke free." The beast turned its head toward Wren. Waited. "Let her through," Osk said again, quieter. "All of you. Let her through." Nobody stopped her. She walked forward with her healer's satchel still slung over one shoulder, hands steady though nothing else in her was, and knelt in the frozen mud beside 300 pounds of battle-blooded wolf that every soldier in camp had been forbidden from touching. Up close, the blood wasn't glory. It was old wounds gone stiff, fur clumped and cracking, the kind of damage that would fester if it wasn't cleaned soon. "Nobody's touched this," she said, "to no one and everyone. That's why the red hasn't broken. You're not held here by fury. You're held here by neglect." She dipped a cloth in the snow melt bucket Fenna shoved toward her, wrung it out, and pressed it to the worst of the wounds along his shoulder. The beast didn't flinch, didn't growl. The tension in that huge body loosened by degrees, like a fist opening one finger at a time. She worked her way down one gash after another, counting them under her breath without meaning to. 11, 12, 13. Each one deep enough that ignoring it for 3 days should have killed a lesser animal outright. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of her hands, instead of the other way around. And somewhere in the 3rd hour, she stopped flinching every time the huge head turned to watch her work. "You're not what they said you'd be," she told it quietly, not expecting an answer, and not getting one. Whatever they were so afraid of in that tent, it isn't this. Behind her, the Hollowmere riders were being escorted out at spear point by the king's own men, who no longer needed instructions to know whose side they stood on. "I'm not doing this because your blood recognizes mine," Wren said quietly, working the cloth along a gash that should have been stitched 2 days ago. "I'm doing it because nobody else in this camp was willing to. That's the part that's mine. Not the bloodline. The choice." The wolf's golden eyes, fixed on her, began, slowly, terribly slowly, to look less empty. It took the better part of the night to clean every wound. And somewhere in the early hours, the beast's shape folded down into a man's. Dark hair, a soldier's scars, breathing like he'd surfaced from deep water. King Corvin Ashvale, aware,
exhausted, and looking at Ren like she was the only fixed point in a spinning room.
You counted every wound before you touched a single one, he said, voice wrecked. I felt you doing it. Nobody's ever bothered to count first.
Somebody had to, before the Red decided the counting for you, Ren said. Everyone else was too busy being afraid of the blood to notice it was killing you slower than the wound was. He didn't answer that. His eyes had already gone to the 3 Hollowmere riders under guard nearby, and past them, to Ulrich, who stood very still with the look of a man doing rapid arithmetic on how much trouble he was in. By the next day, Osk had dragged the rest loose. Ulrich had sold Ren's whereabouts to Hollowmere the hour she arrived, in trade for their blessing on the Vane alliance. You sold me to the people who branded my father's door with my name, Ren said, when they brought Ulrich before the king. For a wedding.
For the kingdom, Ulrich said. The wolf's reaction to you was an accident of blood, not a foundation for a throne.
Corvin's voice, when it came, was very quiet.
You mistook my restraint for permission. That was your second mistake tonight. What was my first? Believing I would ever have let you finish.
Word came at dawn. A Hollowmere warband massing at the northern border, close enough that the scouts could count banners. Corvin was already calling for his captains when Fenna's scream cut across the camp. Ren had gone down between one step and the next, cold sweating through her collar, lips gone the color of old frost.
Widow's frost,
Osk said, kneeling over her, fingers at her throat.
Bred 200 years ago for exactly this blood. There's a reason your line was hunted with more than swords.
Who? Corvin's voice had dropped into something low and dangerous.
The Hollowmere rider you let ride out unsearched.
Osk didn't look up.
A scratch would have been enough. She's had it in her since yesterday.
Corvin's captains were waiting at the tent flap with the border numbers, the warband's position, the window closing on any chance to meet them before they hit the outpost at Vallow Ridge. Every second he spent here was a mile the Hollowmere riders gained.
My king, the captain said, we ride within the hour, or Vallow Ridge burns.
Corvin looked at the captain, then at Ren, gone gray on the cot, breath shallow enough that Osk had stopped counting it out loud.
Take the company, Corvin said. I'm not on that ride. Sir, Vallow Ridge is stone and grain. I can rebuild stone and grain.
He knelt, took Ren's ice-cold hand in both of his, and didn't look up again.
Ride.
They rode without him. By that evening, word came back that Vallow Ridge had fallen. Granaries burned, the garrison scattered, a cost that would be counted in a hard winter to come. Corvin heard the report standing in the doorway of Ren's tent, and didn't flinch, didn't ask a single question about it, because his hands hadn't left hers since noon.
Your own blood runs warm, Osk murmured,
watching them, working it out aloud the way he did. Warmer than most, since the wolf took him. Widow's frost kills by stealing heat the body can't spare. Maybe it's not medicine she needs most. Corvin didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. He stripped his glove and pressed his bare palm flat over her sternum, over the same place she'd once felt his power as a weight she couldn't name, and held it there. Color come back into her mouth an hour later. Her breathing evened out sometime after that. She didn't wake until past midnight, and the first thing she found was his hand still locked around hers, and his eyes, wrecked and awake,
that hadn't left her face once.
"Fallow Ridge," she said, throat raw. "I heard the captain."
"Burned," Corvin said. "I'll rebuild it."
"You should have ridden."
"I did the arithmetic," he said. "A granary rebuilds. You don't." Hollowmere didn't accept the loss of its bargaining chip quietly. 3 days later, a formal envoy rode into Ashgrave territory under a parley banner, led by Wren's own father, demanding the return of Exile property under Old Pack law. They between him in the camp's central yard, the same iron circle where the king had once been kept from the world, chains coiled and unused at its edge now. "She belongs to Hollowmere," her father said, not looking at her directly even now. "Branded and cast, but still bound by blood law until claimed by another pack. One of your riders put widow's frost in her blood 4 days ago," Corvin said. "She nearly died of it in my law camp. Choose your next words to me carefully."
Her father's jaw worked once and said nothing to that at all, which was its own answer. "She's not property," Corvin said. "And she's not unclaimed." "On what grounds does Ashgrave claim her?" Corvin didn't answer with a title or a treaty. He looked at Wren, giving her the space to answer for herself, the way no one in Hollowmere ever had. "On the grounds that I choose it," Wren said, stepping forward before anyone could speak for her. "You didn't lose property, Father. You lost a healer you were too afraid to understand. I'm not walking back through that brand on your door." Her father's jaw tightened. "The blood runs wrong in you." "The blood runs old in me," Wren said. "You called it wrong because you didn't have the courage to call it rare." Behind her, low and warning, Corvin's control frayed at the edges. Not the mindless red this time, but something sharper, aimed and deliberate. "Take the parley banner," he told her father. "And don't come back for her again." Hollowmere rode out before nightfall and didn't return. Ulrich left in irons 2 days later, stripped of his steward's chain, bound for whatever judgment a king reserves for a man who sells a woman to save a coastline. The Vane alliance survived him anyway, renegotiated into a trade agreement instead of a marriage bed, terms Corvin signed himself, the fleet secured without a single vow he hadn't chosen to make. Corvin found Wren afterward at the edge of camp, where the iron stakes had already been pulled from the ground and the fabric prison folded away like it had never stood there at all. "You didn't have to speak for me back there," she said. "I noticed." "Ulrich spent a year arranging a marriage for me before I'd said a single word to Lady Vane," he said. "I know exactly what it costs to have a choice made on your behalf, and dressed up as a kindness. I wasn't doing that to the one person who ever walked toward the blood instead of away from it." "That's not nothing," Wren said. "For a king. The wolf recognized your blood 3 days ago, in a tent, in the middle of the red. That part was instinct. It doesn't ask permission, it just reaches. This part isn't instinct." He held out one hand, scarred, steady, entirely his own. "Stay because you want the terms you set, not because a bond makes it easier to leave you no choice." Wren looked at the hand a long moment, at the healer's calluses that matched her own, at the absence of any leash in the offer. "I want my own tent," she said. "I want to choose my own patience. I want you to remember that I walked toward the blood before I knew what any of this meant to either of us. Done, Corvin said. All of it. She took his hand. Somewhere behind them, faint and content, low enough that only she would ever recognize it for what it was. Something in him, wolf and man both, finally went still. Winter turned over into spring before Fallow Ridge finished rebuilding, and by then the camp had stopped calling her the Exile with the old blood, and started calling her the King's Healer, which she'd decided she preferred, since no one had asked her before naming her the first time. Her own tent stood at the edge of the war camp still, exactly where she'd wanted it, close enough to reach him, and far enough to remind them both the distance was hers to close. The red came for him twice more that year. Both times she was the one who washed the blood off before anyone else was let near. Neither time did he have to ask.